The German Shepherd walked through the front doors of Ravenwood Medical Center at 6:14 in the morning and didn't stop for anyone. Not the security guard who stepped into his path, not the cluster of nurses who reached out to pet him, not the hospital director who snapped her fingers and called him over like he was somebody's lost dog. He moved through the lobby like he had a destination already mapped inside his skull, past the intake desk, past the waiting chairs, past two orderlies who jumped back when he cut between them, and he stopped only when he reached a woman sitting alone at the far end of the corridor. She looked up from a patient chart. Her face went still. The dog sat down at her feet and pressed his head against her knee, and didn't move again. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. You're not going to want to miss what happens next. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. The night shift at Ravenwood Medical Center ended at 6, but Emily Carter had been there since 4:30. She hadn't been called in early. Nobody had asked her to come. She came because Ward 7 had 3 post-surgical patients whose charts were behind, and she knew from experience that the morning crew would hit the ground running with no margin to catch up. So she made coffee in the break room, sat at the nurse's station with a stack of paper that should have been handled 2 days ago, and started working through it in the gray quiet before the building woke up. That was the kind of person Emily was, the kind who showed up early, not because anyone would notice, but because the gap needed filling and she happened to see it. She was 31 years old, medium height, brown hair that she kept pulled back in a tight bun because loose hair was a liability in a hospital, and she'd learned that lesson the hard way in a context that had nothing to do with nursing. She had the kind of face people forgot in crowds. Not unpleasant, just unremarkable in the way that comes from spending years working hard to be invisible. She moved through the ward with a quiet efficiency that some of the other nurses admired and most of the administrative staff simply overlooked. Cedar Falls wasn't a large city. Ravenwood Medical Center wasn't a large hospital, but it was busy. One of 2 full-service facilities within 40 miles. And it ran on a permanent undercurrent of low-grade chaos that most of the staff had long since normalized. Beds were tight, staffing was tighter, and the political climate inside the building had gotten noticeably worse in the 14 months since Victoria Hale had been appointed hospital director. Emily was thinking about none of that. She was working through a medication reconciliation form for a 67-year-old man in room 714 who'd come in 3 days ago with a bowel obstruction and who still couldn't keep water down, and she was trying to figure out why the previous night's dosage notes didn't match what the attending had ordered. The math was off by enough to matter and not enough to be immediately obvious, which was the most dangerous kind of wrong. She was so focused on the chart that she didn't notice the front desk buzzer going off or the security guard's voice rising slightly from down the corridor. She noticed the sound of claws on tile. It was a specific sound. She'd have recognized it anywhere. Emily looked up. The German Shepherd was about 40 feet away when she first saw him, moving at a steady trot with his nose low and his ears forward, cutting through the corridor with a kind of focused certainty that made the 2 orderlies behind him step reflexively to the sides. He was large, 85, maybe 90 pounds, and he wore a vest that she didn't look at long enough to read because her eyes had already found his face. He found hers at the same moment. He stopped. His tail, which had been held neutral and businesslike, went sideways once, twice, and then the rest of him caught up with it, and he closed the remaining distance between them in 3 seconds, sat down at her feet, and pressed the side of his head firmly against her knee. Emily sat very still for a moment. Then she set the chart down on the desk beside her and lowered her hand to the back of his neck. "Rex," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. The dog made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a sigh. Behind him, the security guard arrived, slightly out of breath. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. He came in through the service entrance. I don't know how he got past the—" "It's all right," Emily said. She didn't look up. "He's not— Do you know this dog?" She scratched behind his ear, the specific spot that had always made him press harder into her hand. He pressed harder into her hand. "Yes," she said. "I know him." The guard hovered. Emily didn't offer anything else. He eventually retreated, and she sat for another minute in the empty corridor with the dog's weight against her leg and the medication chart she'd been staring at for 40 minutes sitting abandoned beside her. And she breathed slowly and tried to think about what it meant that Rex was here. She already knew it wasn't good. Victoria Hale arrived at 7:15, as she did every weekday, and she arrived in the way she did everything, announcing herself through the quality of her entrance rather than any particular sound or statement. She was 53, tall, with silver-streaked hair worn short and severe in a style that broadcast efficiency. She carried a leather portfolio that Emily had never seen her open. She wore heels in a building where heels were a genuinely baffling choice, and she wore them the way some people wore armor. The first thing she did every morning was walk the main floor. The second thing she did was find something wrong. Emily had learned this in her first month at Ravenwood. She'd also learned that Victoria's eye, sharp for inefficiency, sharp for what she considered sloppiness, tended to fall disproportionately on the nurses. Physicians were colleagues to be managed. Nurses were a category of problem to be administered. Emily had mostly managed to stay below her radar by staying quiet and keeping her documentation clean. Mostly. Victoria's heels found the corridor at 7:20. Emily heard them coming and didn't look up from the medication chart she'd returned to. She'd found the error, had flagged it, was now writing the correction note, and she was still writing when Victoria stopped. "Carter." Emily looked up. "Good morning, Dr. Hale." Victoria's gaze had already moved from Emily to the dog, sitting beside the nurse's station with patient authority, his vest now clearly visible. It read, K9 Unit, Cedar Falls County, and below that, a smaller line Emily couldn't see from her angle. "What?" Victoria said, with the deliberate pause of someone who was choosing their words because the alternative was losing her composure, "is that animal doing in my hospital?" "He came in about an hour ago. I can see he came in. I'm asking why he's still here. We have immunocompromised patients on this floor, Carter. We have surgical recovery wards. We have—" "I know," Emily said. "I was going to call animal services once I finished flagging this chart. There was a medication error I wanted to make sure got noted before the morning attending came on." Victoria's eyes shifted back to Emily. There was a quality to that look, a kind of reflexive skepticism that Emily had learned not to react to. "What medication error?" "Room 714. The overnight dosage notes don't match Dr. Sorrento's order. It's about 40 milligrams off on the metoclopramide. Not critical, but I wanted it documented before handoff." Victoria stared at her for a moment. Then she reached for the chart in a way that made Emily release it without being asked, and scanned it with the speed of someone who knew exactly where to look for what she was looking for. Silence. Emily waited. "The correct notation format," Victoria said finally, returning the chart without looking at Emily, "is to flag it through the digital system, not handwrite a note in the margin. We went over this at the November meeting. The paperwork protocol exists for a reason." Emily kept her face neutral. "I flagged it in the system first. I was writing the margin note as a backup for the incoming nurse. That's not the protocol." "I know. I thought a redundancy might be, the protocol exists to prevent exactly the kind of inconsistency that redundant handwritten notations create." Victoria's voice was measured and cool and carrying, the way voices carry in empty corridors when they're designed to carry. "I'd like you to go back through your last 2 weeks of charts and ensure your documentation meets standard. If I find another instance of protocol deviation, we'll need to discuss your position here more formally." The phrase "your position here" landed with exactly the weight Victoria intended it to. Emily held eye contact and said, "Understood." "And get the dog out." Victoria moved on. Her heels continued down the corridor and turned left and were gone. Emily sat with it for a moment. Then she looked down at Rex, who had been watching Victoria's retreat with an expression that, on a human face, would have been described as measured contempt. "Don't look at me like that," she said quietly. Rex looked at her instead. The morning moved the way mornings in the ward always moved, fast, then faster, then suddenly frantic, and then, for no clear reason, briefly calm. Emily handed off the medication flag to Dr. Sorrento, who caught the error and thanked her with the slightly distracted gratitude of someone who was already thinking about something else. She administered 2 rounds of post-surgical checks. She sat with a 62-year-old woman named Darlene, who was 3 days out from a hip replacement and was scared in a way that had nothing to do with pain, who kept asking if she was getting better, which was really asking something else entirely. "You're doing fine," Emily told her. "I mean that. Your numbers are good, your incision is clean, and you slept 4 hours last night, which is better than you're giving yourself credit for." "My daughter's coming Thursday," Darlene said. "She doesn't know I had the surgery. I didn't want to worry her." Emily adjusted the blood pressure cuff. "That sounds exhausting, carrying something like that alone." Darlene looked at her sideways. "It is, but she'd hover, and hovering makes me feel worse." "Some people show love by hovering," Emily said. "Some people show love by disappearing and pretending nothing happened, which, respectfully, is not better." She made a note. "Let her come, let her hover a little. It doesn't have to mean you're helpless." Darlene was quiet for a moment. Then, "You seem like someone who's had to tell herself that before." Emily wrote the final notation, clicked the pen closed. "Get some rest before lunch. I'll check your pressure again at 2. She left without answering. She was good at that. Rex had been relocated temporarily to an empty family consultation room at the end of the hall. It wasn't regulation. She knew that. She'd left water in a plastic basin from the supply closet and told the younger orderly, Marcus, that she'd figure out who to call once she cleared her patient rounds. Marcus was 24 and thought dogs were great and asked no further questions, which was exactly the response she needed. She thought while she was doing her rounds about how Rex had found her. She thought about what it meant that they'd sent him ahead. She'd spent 5 years building a life at Ravenwood that had nothing to do with who she'd been before. Not a fake life, not a lie exactly, but a deliberate narrowing, a choice to step out of one world and into a smaller, quieter one, where the stakes were human-scaled and the victories were things like catching a medication error or talking a scared 62-year-old through an ordinary Thursday. She was good at the smaller world. She'd worked to be good at it. Rex's arrival was not a small world event. She was thinking about this. Too hard, probably, moving faster down the corridor than she needed to. When she turned the corner near the pharmacy window and walked directly into Dr. Warren Finch, who was holding 2 cups of coffee and managed to save one of them. Carter. He'd absorbed the impact with the resigned competence of someone who'd worked in a hospital long enough that nothing surprised him. He was the senior attending on Ward 7, early 50s, thick through the chest, with the kind of face that made patients trust him immediately and made administrators nervous in ways they couldn't articulate. He handed her the surviving coffee. "You look like you're walking toward a problem." "I'm fine." "Nobody walks that fast when they're fine." He fell into step beside her. "Heard Hale got after you this morning." Emily glanced at him. "It wasn't a big deal." "The medication catch was a big deal. She shouldn't have—" He stopped. "You know what? Never mind. I wasn't there. What's going on with the dog?" Emily considered briefly how much to say. "Old acquaintance," she said. "I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle it." Warren looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, the way that meant he knew there was more underneath and had decided not to push. "All right, whatever you need. Marcus says he's calm. He's always calm. You know I'm going to need a slightly better story than old acquaintance at some point." "I know," she said. "I just don't have one yet." She checked her watch. It was 9:47. She had a window of about 40 minutes before her next round, and she used it to go to the consultation room and sit on the floor with Rex. She sat on the floor because it was easier than hunching, and because being low to the ground next to him was a thing she hadn't done in a long time, and it still felt the way it had always felt, which was like a specific kind of rest she didn't know she'd been missing. She ran her fingers over his vest. He was older. Of course he was older. The gray around his muzzle had spread since she last saw him, and there was a stiffness in the way he carried his left foreleg that she didn't like. She checked it without thinking about it, pressing gently along the muscle groups, and he let her. And she thought, not for the first time, not even for the 100th, about the night she'd spent in a forward staging area with her hands on this dog's chest, counting his breaths, telling the handler that he was going to make it even when she wasn't sure. She'd been right. She was usually right about the things that mattered, even when she was wrong about a dozen smaller things on the way to them. "What's happening?" she said quietly. Not a question, or not really, more like a statement she was working up to understanding. Rex turned his head and looked at her with dark, entirely serious eyes. "Okay," she said. But the afternoon hit the ward hard around 2 o'clock, the way afternoons in Ward 7 tended to, a run of minor emergencies arriving close enough together to compress the available time into something much smaller than it looked. A patient in 709 spiked a fever. A family in the waiting area had questions that the volunteer coordinator couldn't answer, and eventually escalated to Emily because she happened to be closest. A delivery arrived for the pharmacy that required 3 signatures and came at exactly the moment when all 3 required people were somewhere else. Emily navigated it the way she navigated most things, by staying ahead of the next problem instead of trying to fight the current one. And by 3:15, it had settled back into the low ambient pressure of a normal ward afternoon. It was 3:17 when Victoria appeared again. Emily was at the station, updating charts. She didn't look up right away. She heard the heels. She finished the line she was writing. Carter. Victoria had someone with her this time, Angela Park, the nursing coordinator, who had the expression of someone who would very much like to be somewhere else. "This afternoon at 4 o'clock, I'd like you to meet with Angela and HR regarding the documentation issue from this morning." Emily looked up. "A formal meeting?" A clarifying conversation. Victoria's tone made it clear the distinction was semantic. "The protocol deviation this morning was not an isolated incident. Angela has been tracking recurring irregularities in your file documentation over the past several weeks." Emily looked at Angela. Angela looked at a point roughly 6 inches to the left of Emily's face. "What irregularities?" Emily asked. "We'll discuss it at 4, Victoria said. "Angela will send you the room number. I'd like to know now, if possible, so I can pull the relevant charts before the meeting." Something moved across Victoria's face. Not quite displeasure, because displeasure was what she'd walked in with, more like recalibration. She hadn't expected that response. "The charts are already flagged in the system." "Then I'd like to review the flags before we meet. That way we're all working from the same information." There was a pause. Short, but present. 4 o'clock, Carter." Victoria left. Angela met Emily's eyes for exactly half a second before following her. Emily turned back to her chart. She wrote 2 more lines. Then she set the pen down, very deliberately, and looked at the wall, and reminded herself that anger was a resource she needed to spend carefully. She was still sitting there when Marcus appeared at the door to the consultation room, down the corridor. He had his phone in his hand. His face was doing something complicated. "Hey, Emily." "What?" "I was just going to check on the dog. He's fine, totally fine, but there's a convoy outside." Emily turned to look at him. "Say that again?" "Like 3 black vehicles, military plates. 2 of them have K9 insignia." Marcus held up his phone. He'd taken a photo through the lobby window, so 3 dark SUVs parked in the pickup lane, still running, with a 4th vehicle that was longer and darker angled behind them. Standing beside the lead vehicle was a man in a utility uniform who was looking up at the hospital entrance with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who had plenty of time and knew exactly what they'd come for. "The security desk is losing it. Do you—" He stopped. "Emily, do you know what this is?" Emily stood up from the desk. She straightened her badge. She smoothed the front of her scrubs once, a habit from a long time ago, and a very different uniform. "Tell security to hold," she said, "and give me 2 minutes." She walked down the corridor to the consultation room. She opened the door. Rex lifted his head. She crouched down and looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "I guess we're doing this." Rex stood up. He walked to the door. He waited. She clipped his lead, a spare one she'd found in the supply closet. Not his vest's lead, but it would do. And she walked with him back down the corridor toward the lobby. She could hear the front desk from 40 feet away, a murmur of competing voices. As she came around the corner, she saw through the lobby glass that one of the convoy's rear doors had opened, and the man she'd clocked for Marcus's photo was already walking toward the entrance. He walked the way she remembered him walking, like the ground was optional, like he was covering distance rather than crossing it. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked more carved than aged. He pushed through the glass doors and stopped when he saw her. "Emily Carter," Commander Mason Reed said. "Commander," she said. Behind her, she could feel the entire lobby listening. The security desk had gone quiet. Two of the intake nurses had turned from their stations. Dr. Finch had come through the south doors at some point and was standing just inside them with a coffee cup held halfway to his mouth, not drinking. Reed looked at Rex. Rex, for his part, was sitting beside Emily's left leg with the composed dignity of a diplomat. "He found you fast," Reed said.
"He always did," Emily said. "Why are you here, Mason?" He met her eyes. He looked like someone holding a piece of information with both hands, carefully, because of what it was. "We've got a situation, field trauma. 4 of ours, 1 critical, 2 unstable, 1 walking wounded who won't be walking much longer." He paused. "We're 4 hours out from the nearest military medical facility. We were already routing this direction when Rex confirmed I was here," she said. "When Rex confirmed you were here." He didn't apologize for that. He knew she wouldn't want him to. "Emily, I need your hands on this." The lobby was absolutely silent. Emily looked at him. She looked at Rex. She looked, for one brief moment, at the door that led back to Ward 7, to the charts and the HR meeting and Victoria Hale's 4 o'clock conversation about documentation protocols. "What are their injuries?" she said. Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to her. She opened it and read quickly. The kind of fast reading that isn't scanning, that's absorbing, that comes from years of learning to extract what matters from a page in less time than most people take to find the right line. Her face didn't change while she read. That was training. Underneath the neutral face, her mind was already moving through triage priorities, sequencing, resource availability, what Ravenwood had and what it didn't, and what could be improvised and what couldn't. She folded the paper back up. She looked at Reed. "You've got 1 tension pneumothorax, 1 abdominal bleed that's probably hepatic given the mechanism, and 2 blast concussions. That about right?" "You read fast." "You need a level 2 trauma bay, 2 ORs on standby, and a surgeon who's done blast injury work. Does Ravenwood have that?" "That's what I need you to tell me." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. 1 trauma bay, 1 OR that can go immediately, second within 30 minutes if you can wait. The attending on call tonight has done civilian blast work. It's not the same, but it's not nothing. She looked at him steadily. "Is it enough?" Reed held her gaze. "It has to be." From somewhere behind Emily, a voice said, "What is going on here?" Victoria Hale had arrived. She was standing at the edge of the lobby with Angela Park 2 steps behind her, and the expression of someone who had walked into a situation that was operating entirely outside of her authority structure and who was not going to let that stand. "Dr. Hale," Emily said, without turning, "I need Trauma Bay 1, and I need to reach Dr. Yates in surgery." "You need to—" Victoria stopped. Started again. "Carter, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this hospital has an intake protocol for a reason, and military or otherwise, no patient arrives here without—" "They'll arrive in 3 hours," Emily said. She turned, finally, so she was facing Victoria directly. "One of them may not have 3 hours if I spend them on intake forms. I need Trauma Bay 1. I need Yates, and I need the dispensary to pull a list I'm going to write in the next 10 minutes. She held eye contact. "I will do the paperwork when the patients are stable, not before." The room was watching. Victoria knew the room was watching. "You are a floor nurse," Victoria said very quietly. "You do not issue orders in this hospital." "Today I do," Emily said, and there was nothing in her voice when she said it. No heat, no triumph, no performance of authority. Just the flat certainty of a person who had made harder decisions than this one and had learned that wavering in the moment of them cost more than it saved. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Reed, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who had watched this kind of standoff before and was very calmly waiting for it to resolve. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Warren Finch's voice came from the south doors. "I'll get Yates." He was already moving. "Carter, write your list." Emily turned back to the desk and reached for a notepad. Behind her, she heard Reed exhale once. Not quite a sound.
more like the audible equivalent of acknowledgement. And Victoria Hale stood very still in the middle of her own lobby, in her own hospital, and did not say another word. Emily wrote fast, not sloppy fast, but the compressed, purposeful speed of someone who had written lists like this before in conditions where the lighting was bad, and the surface was worse than a nursing station desk. Trauma bay supply requirements, blood type contingencies, surgical prep checklist for blast pattern injury, which was different from civilian trauma in ways that mattered and ways that hospitals like Ravenwood weren't always ready to understand. She tore the sheet off the notepad and handed it to Marcus, who had appeared at her elbow with the slightly dazed expression of someone watching a movie while also somehow being in it. Dispensary, right now. Whatever's not in stock, find out immediately and tell me. Marcus took the list and moved. Emily turned to Reed. What's their ETA now? 2 hours 40, depending on traffic through the bypass. And the critical one. What's his pressure running? Reed reached for his radio. He spoke into it, listened, relayed the number. Emily had already started walking. Systolic's dropping, she said, more to herself than to Reed. He needs fluid before he gets here, not when he arrives. She turned. You have a medic in that convoy? Specialist Owens. She's been managing. Tell Owens to push another liter of saline and keep him elevated, and I need hourly BP updates from this point forward. She stopped at the pharmacy window. Janet, I need to talk to whoever's on the surgical floor. Janet Rourke, who had been working the pharmacy window at Ravenwood for 11 years and had a baseline expression of patient skepticism, looked from Emily to Reed to Rex, who was sitting beside Emily with the composed gravity of a hospital chaplain, and reached for her phone without asking any questions. It took Emily another 20 minutes to get the pieces in position. She spoke to the OR coordinator, a compact, decisive woman named Patrice, who had seen enough to not waste time being surprised. And between the two of them, they cleared the surgical suite and got Dr. Yates, short for Yolanda Yates, 56 years old, cardiothoracic specialist with a side history in vascular surgery that she rarely mentioned, out of a routine consultation and into a phone briefing. Yates listened to Emily's summary with the clipped attention of someone mentally triaging as she heard it. Hepatic bleed, you said. Based on what? Mechanism and location. Right flank impact, rigid abdomen on arrival report, pressure trending down faster than you'd expect from blood loss alone. Could be splenic. Could be, Emily said. I'd prep for both. Yates was quiet for 2 seconds. All right, I'll want imaging this moment he's in the bay. I know. And Carter, I'm going to need someone in that room who understands the injury pattern, not just standard trauma. I know, Emily said again. She hung up and stood for a moment with her hand still on the receiver. Around her, the hospital had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that someone walking through the front door would necessarily notice, but perceptibly, the way a building changes when the people inside it start moving with purpose. The quality of noise was different. The pace was different. Reed came to stand beside her, not crowding, just present. You've done this before, he said. Obviously. I mean here, in this place, the way you moved them. Emily picked up her own notepad and made a correction to the prep list. They're good people, she said. They just needed a frame. Reed watched her for a moment. There was something in his face, not quite apology, not quite admiration, something that sat in the middle of both and didn't have a clean name. Emily, don't, she said quietly. He didn't. The 4 o'clock meeting happened anyway. This was the thing about institutions. They didn't pause for crises unless the crisis was their kind of crisis, and Victoria Hale's kind of crisis was the kind that could be measured in compliance metrics and documentation audits. The convoy in the pickup lane was a military matter. The trauma preparation was a medical matter. The question of whether Emily Carter had been adhering to proper charting protocol for the past 6 weeks was an administrative matter, and administrative matters had scheduled meeting times. Angela Park found Emily at 3:55, outside the dispensary, checking the supply inventory Marcus had pulled against her original list. She had a clipboard and the apologetic posture of someone delivering news they didn't write. "Emily, the 4 o'clock—" "I know," Emily said. She made a mark on the list. "We're short on intercostal drains." "We have some in storage, I think." "Emily, Dr. Hale is—" "She's expecting—" "How many in storage?" Angela stopped, blinked. I don't know. Maybe 4? 6? "Find out. And ask Janet if we can get an emergency supply order through before 6. Emily handed the clipboard back to Marcus and looked at Angela. "I'll come to the meeting, but I need 5 more minutes." She got 7 because the supply question took longer than she expected, and because Marcus had found a second issue, a vacuum drain that had been signed out 3 weeks ago and hadn't been returned and couldn't be immediately located. And by the time she walked into conference room B, it was 4:12, and Victoria Hale was sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded on top of her portfolio and the expression of a woman who had been counting minutes. Angela sat to Victoria's left. A woman Emily recognized as Susan Marsh from HR sat to her right, with a laptop open and a printed document face down in front of her. Emily sat down across from them. She didn't apologize for being late. "I'll keep this as brief as possible," Victoria said. "There are outstanding concerns about your documentation practices that we need to address formally." "All right," Emily said. Susan Marsh turned the printed document face up and slid it across the table. Emily looked at it. It was a compilation of chart notations, 8, maybe 10 instances, flagged with yellow highlight. She read through them quickly. 3 of these flags are for margin notations on charts where I also completed the digital entry, Emily said, which is what I explained this morning. The protocol, I understand the protocol. The margin notes were supplementary, not replacements. She looked up. The other flags, can you show me the specific concern? Susan Marsh leaned forward and pointed. This entry, for instance, the timestamp shows 5:43 a.m., but your shift start is logged at 6. I came in early. You weren't on the schedule. I know. I came in early because Ward 7 had chart backlogs, and I knew the morning crew would be stretched. She looked at Victoria. I wasn't billing overtime. I wasn't asking for compensation. I came in because the work needed doing. Victoria's expression didn't shift. That's not the point. What is the point? A pause. Victoria and Susan exchanged a look that Emily was meant to see. Unauthorized access to patient records outside of scheduled hours creates liability concerns, Victoria said. It also creates auditing complications. The fact that your motivations may have been good doesn't mitigate the procedural issue. Emily looked at the document in front of her. She thought about saying several things. She thought about the 67-year-old man in 714 whose medication error she had caught at 5:43 in the morning, and what would have happened if she'd waited until 6 to find it. She thought about the shape of this meeting. The document turned face down before she arrived, the 2-against-1 seating arrangement, the way Angela was looking carefully at the table surface. She thought about the convoy outside, and the critical patient in transit, and Dr. Yates standing by in surgical prep. She thought about the 4 o'clock meeting that happened anyway. What outcome are you looking for here? She asked. Her voice was even. Victoria held her gaze. A formal notation in your file, and a commitment that you will adhere to scheduled hours and protocol standards going forward. A formal notation. Yes. Emily looked at the document one more time. Then she pushed it back across the table. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign, she said. Can we schedule a follow-up for next week to go through the specific flags together? I'd like to address each one individually. Victoria blinked. It was a small blink, barely visible, but Emily had been reading faces long enough to know what it meant. It meant she'd been expecting something other than that. Yes, that's a reasonable request. Good. Emily stood up. I have a patient situation I need to get back to. Angela, can you email me the follow-up time? She looked at Victoria. Dr. Hale. She left. She walked back down the hallway, turned the corner, and stood for a moment in the alcove beside the supply room where nobody could see her and let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. The trouble was everything that happened afterward, in the quiet, when the thing that mattered had passed. Rex found her in the alcove. She didn't know how he got out of the consultation room. Marcus had probably left the door cracked, but he was there, pressing his nose into the back of her hand, and she let him. "I know," she said. He sat down. She crouched so they were at eye level. She had left the military because she'd wanted to. That part was true, and she'd never tried to revise it. 4 years of combat support operations, of forward staging areas and field medical units, and the particular math of triage, in conditions where the math always came up short. She'd done it because she was good at it, and she'd stopped because being good at it had started to cost her things she couldn't afford to lose: her own sleep, her ability to sit in a quiet room without listening for something, the capacity to believe that most of the problems she'd face in a given day were solvable. She'd built Ravenwood as a correction, smaller scale, human scale, problems with solutions. She hadn't accounted for Victoria Hale, but then you couldn't account for everything. She stood up. "Come on," she said. The convoy updated her at 5:30. Systolic pressure on the critical patient. Specialist First Class Damon Vick, 27, 2 combat tours, currently unconscious, had stabilized slightly. Owens, the convoy medic, had managed the fluid balance well. Better than Emily had expected, which meant Owens was good, which was one fewer thing to worry about. The other 3 were moving under their own power, more or less. Both blast concussions were symptomatic: headache, disorientation, light sensitivity, the usual progression, and would need neuroevaluation. The walking wounded, who wouldn't be walking long, had a lower leg laceration that had been poorly packed and was still seeping. Not critical, but not nothing, and infection risk was climbing with every hour. Emily talked Owens through a secondary dressing technique over the phone. She could hear the road in the background, the ambient noise of 3 vehicles moving in convoy formation. "You're doing good work," she told Owens. A pause on the line. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Are you Emily Carter?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Vic's handler briefed me before we left. He said if we routed through Cedar Falls. Owens stopped, restarted. He said to trust whatever you said. The handler knows Commander Reed? Trained under him, small unit. Everyone knows everyone. Emily looked out the lobby window at the parking lot where Reed's convoy vehicles sat. 2 of his people were outside, standing in the cold, not talking, just watching the road. "How's Vic's color?" "Pale. Real pale." "Keep the saline going. I'll see you in 2 hours." She hung up. She turned and nearly walked into Warren Finch for the second time that day. He was carrying a different coffee this time, paper cup, dispensary machine, and he held it out to her. She took it. "Yates is ready," he said. "OR team's prepped. Patrice has got the second suite on standby." He watched her. "You want to tell me what kind of trauma we're actually dealing with?" "Blast injuries, field conditions. At least 1 patient who's going to need vascular work." Warren was quiet for a moment. "And you know blast injuries because..." Emily drank the coffee. It was bad. Dispensary machine coffee was always bad. "Because I worked in a context where blast injuries happen frequently." "Which context?" "Warren." He put his hands up. "All right, none of my business." He glanced toward the lobby where Reed was standing near the windows with a phone at his ear. "That man looks at you like someone who owes you something." "He doesn't owe me anything." "Doesn't look that way." Emily set the coffee cup down on the nearest flat surface. "I need to check on Darlene in 624. Then I need to be in the lobby at 7. "I'll cover 624. She looked at him. "You're a senior attending, Warren. You don't need to..." "I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway." He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who'd stopped performing indifference about things he actually cared about sometime in his mid-40s. "Go get ready for whatever this is." She almost said thank you. Instead, she said, "She's nervous about her daughter coming Thursday. Don't give her the clinical version." "I know how to talk to patients, Carter." "I know you do. That's why I'm telling you." She walked toward the lobby before he could respond to that. The convoy arrived at 7:11, 37 minutes ahead of the updated ETA, which meant Owens had pushed the driver faster than recommended. Emily didn't blame her. Vic's pressure had dropped again in the last call. The vehicles came in hard through the ambulance bay. Not careless, not reckless, but fast in the way that people move when they've been holding a situation together by discipline alone and they've finally reached the place where they can let someone else hold it. The bay doors opened. The back of the second vehicle opened, and then it was controlled chaos, the specific kind that looks like disorder from outside and is actually a very tight system running very fast. Emily was already at the bay. She'd changed into surgical scrubs. They weren't hers. She'd borrowed them from the locker room, and they were slightly too large through the shoulders, and she had an earpiece in connected to Patrice in the OR and a tablet in her left hand with Vic's incoming vitals. Owens dropped out of the vehicle first. She was young, 22, maybe 23, with dried blood on her sleeve and the tight-eyed look of someone running on the far side of tired. "Hepatic," Emily said. Not a question. "Everything you said, maybe more." Owens moved to the back of the vehicle. He held on, scared me twice. "You handled it. Barely. Barely counts." They brought Vic out on the stretcher. He was pale the way Owens had described, and then some. The kind of pale that meant his body had been making hard decisions about where to send available blood, and the answers it had chosen weren't sustainable much longer. His BP was 88/60. His breathing was fast and shallow. Emily put her hand on his wrist. Not to check his pulse, she could read that on the monitor, but because she knew from experience that unconscious patients registered touch in ways that didn't show up on charts. "You're at Ravenwood," she said. "We've got you." She didn't know if he heard her. She said it anyway. The next 4 minutes were loud and fast and specific in the way that medical emergencies are specific. The controlled shouting of people who know exactly what they're doing and are doing it quickly, the rattle of equipment, the staccato check-ins from Patrice in her ear. They got Vic into Trauma Bay 1. Yates arrived at a controlled run. She didn't sprint. She never sprinted. She said once that surgeons who sprinted were surgeons who arrived out of breath, and took the handoff from Emily with 3 targeted questions and 2 confirmations. "Get imaging on him now," Yates said. "I want to see what we're looking at before we open him up." "In process," Emily said. "And you're staying." It wasn't a question. Emily hadn't planned to answer it as one. "Yes." The other 3 patients came in behind Vic in a staggered sequence. The blast concussions went to neuroevaluation. The walking wounded. Staff Sergeant Reginald Marsh, 34, who moved under his own power with the determined grimace of a man who was not going to be carried if he could possibly help it, went to wound care, where the secondary dressing Emily had talked Owens through over the phone finally got a proper replacement. Reed was in the bay. He stayed out of the way. He knew how to do that, how to be present without occupying space that was needed for something else. And he watched Emily work with an expression she felt rather than saw. It was somewhere between the imaging and Yates's preliminary assessment that Victoria appeared. She came in through the staff entrance at the far end of the bay, and Emily noticed her from across the room and then returned her attention to the imaging monitor and the conversation she was having with Yates, because that was the order of priority and she knew it. But Victoria stayed. She didn't leave when the bay got crowded. She didn't retreat when Yates called for a specific instrument and the whole room reconfigured around it. She stood near the wall and she watched, and Emily, in the moment she could spare, noticed that Victoria's face was doing something it didn't usually do, something she hadn't seen on it before. Vic went to the OR at 7:49. Yates and her team took him through the double doors and the bay decompressed suddenly, the intense forward momentum of the last 40 minutes dissipating into the kind of quiet that feels loud because of what it follows. Emily stood beside the now empty trauma table. She pulled off her gloves. She noticed her hands were, finally, very slightly unsteady. She pressed them flat against the side of the table and waited for it to pass. "Carter." She turned. Victoria was still there. They stood across the empty bay from each other in the fluorescent-lit after-quiet, and for the first time since Emily had worked at Ravenwood, Victoria Hale looked like a woman who was trying to locate a version of herself that was adequate to the moment and wasn't quite finding it. "That soldier," Victoria said. "Vic, he's in surgery." Emily's voice was neutral. "Yates is good. He has a reasonable chance." "What you did? The preparation? The coordination?" Victoria stopped. started differently. How did you know what to do? Emily looked at her. I've done it before. Where? The question sat there. Emily looked at the double doors that Vic had gone through and thought about all the ways she could answer that question and chose the most honest one. Somewhere that doesn't exist on any document you'd have access to, she said. Not anymore. Victoria absorbed that. She was quiet for long enough that Emily assumed the conversation was ending. Then Victoria said, the formal notation, from this afternoon. Emily waited. I'd like to revisit it. Emily held her gaze. She waited another moment to be sure Victoria wasn't about to pivot into something else. She wasn't. Next week, Emily said, like we discussed. Victoria nodded once. She turned and walked out through the staff entrance, her heels quieter somehow on the way out than they'd been on the way in. Emily stood in the empty bay for another moment. Then she went to find Reed, because the night wasn't finished and she had 3 more patients to check and a medic named Owens who needed to eat something before she fell over. She found Reed outside the bay, in the corridor with his phone in his hand and an expression she didn't like. She knew that expression. She'd seen it in the field, in the moment before bad information arrived. What? She said. He looked up. I need to show you something. Not here. He glanced down the corridor. Somewhere quiet. Reed. It's not about Vic, he said, which was the first thing, and then his face told her the second thing, which was that whatever it was about her. Tell me, she said. He turned his phone around and showed her the screen. On it was a document, official header, which was the first thing, and then his face told her the second thing, which was that whatever it was about her. Tell me, she said. He turned his phone around and showed her the screen. On it was a document, official header, classification markings, her name at the top. And it took her exactly 2 seconds to understand what she was looking at. Her classified service record. Declassified. Filed 3 days ago. Not by her. Emily looked at the screen. She looked at Reed. She thought about the convoy arriving in Cedar Falls. About Rex finding her in the corridor this morning. About the way this day had moved from one thing to the next with a quality she recognized now as inevitability. Who filed it? She asked. Her voice was very quiet. Reed said a name she hadn't heard in 4 years, and the floor of the world she'd built in Cedar Falls shifted under her feet in a way she could not yet see the shape of. The name Reed said was Colonel Doris Farwell. Emily had worked under Farwell for 2 of her 4 years in the field. Farwell was the kind of officer who didn't ask for things. She arranged for them to happen, and you found out after. She was methodical, sharp, and she had a particular philosophy about people she considered assets. You didn't let them disappear into civilian life without maintaining a thread back to them. Not a leash. A thread. The distinction mattered to Farwell. Emily had never been entirely sure it was a real distinction. Why now? Emily said. Reed pocketed his phone. There's a review underway. Congressional. Oversight committee looking at the operational record of forward medical units from 4 years back. They're going through everything. He paused. Your record came up. Farwell moved to declassify it before the committee could use it without context. Use it for what? There were decisions made in your unit that the committee is characterizing as, their word, irregular. Emily looked at him steadily. Irregular meaning what? Meaning they want to understand who made them and under what authority. Reed kept his voice even. Your name is in 3 operational reports that are now part of the review. Farwell declassified your service record, so there's a complete picture on file. So the committee can't take those 3 reports and build whatever version of the story is most useful to them, Emily said. Yes. She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. Farwell had done it as protection. That didn't make it not a violation. That didn't make it not a choice someone else had made with Emily's history, on Emily's behalf, without asking Emily. What decisions? She said. Which ones are they flagging? Reed was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to tell her it was more than one thing. The Kessler Pass extraction. And the decision to hold the casualty site for 72 hours pending air support. Emily said nothing. She looked at the wall behind Reed's shoulder, at the institutional beige paint and the framed hand-washing instruction poster that was slightly crooked, and she let the names settle into the room the way they always did when they came up. which was rarely and always unexpectedly, and always at the cost of whatever equilibrium she'd built around not thinking about them. Kessler Pass, 72 hours. 4 patients she'd kept alive on supplies that were rated for 48 hours, and the creative application of what she could find, and one she hadn't kept alive. And the weight of that arithmetic was something she still carried in her chest in the quiet hours before she fell asleep. "Are they coming here?" she said. "2 committee staffers, tomorrow morning. Here, to this hospital." They tracked Rex's deployment. It's in the county K-9 log.
Reed looked like he wanted to say something else and was working out whether to say it. He said it. "Emily, if you want to get ahead of this, I can—" "No," she said. Quiet, not hard. "Not tonight. Tonight we make sure Vic gets through surgery and the other 3 are stable." She pushed off the wall. "Tomorrow is tomorrow." Reed nodded. He looked like a man who had delivered the message he came to deliver and felt only partially better for having delivered it. "Go check on your people," Emily said. "I'll update you on Vic when Yates comes out."
Vic's surgery ran 2 hours and 19 minutes. Emily knew this because she was in the scrub-out area adjacent to the OR for most of it. Not inside, because she wasn't credentialed for surgery at Ravenwood, a fact that had never bothered her until tonight, monitoring through the window and the running commentary that Patrice was relaying through the OR intercom. Yates worked fast and without narration, which was her style, communicating with her team in the compressed shorthand of people who had operated together enough times that full sentences were a luxury. The hepatic bleed was larger than the imaging had suggested. Not dramatically, it wasn't the kind of larger that changed the entire operation, but enough that Yates had to make an intraoperative decision about whether to repair or to pack and stage, and she chose to repair, and that added 40 minutes. Emily tracked the blood pressure readings on the monitor in the scrub-out area and tried not to count the minutes between them. At 9:58, Yates came through the OR doors pulling off her surgical cap. She stopped when she saw Emily. "He's closed," she said. "Fitzroy, pressure's coming up. He's going to be sore for a while, but the repair held." Emily let out a breath she'd been rationing for the past 90 minutes. The bleed source? Posterior right lobe. Small branch of the hepatic vein. Clean once we got to it. Yates peeled off her gloves. "Your field assessment was correct. Whoever your medic is, she kept him alive long enough for us to do something useful." "I'll tell her." Yates looked at her for a moment with the level, evaluative look of a surgeon who formed opinions quickly and changed them rarely. "You've done trauma work before, not just nursing level." I've been around trauma," Emily said. "That's not the same thing as what you were doing tonight." Yates paused. "I'm not prying. I'm just telling you I noticed." Emily nodded once. "Thank you. For Vic." "Don't thank me yet. He's not out of the woods. Recovery is going to be 4 to 6 weeks minimum, and that's if nothing complicates." She started moving toward the locker room. "Get some sleep, Carter. You look like you've been on for 18 hours. 16, Emily said. Yates had already turned the corner. She found Owens sitting on a plastic chair in the corridor outside neuro-evaluation, with her elbows on her knees and her head tilted back against the wall and her eyes closed. She'd changed out of the blood-stained gear. Someone, Marcus, probably, had found her a set of civilian scrubs that were too large and made her look even younger than she was. Emily sat down in the chair beside her. Owens opened her eyes. "Vic?" she said, before Emily could say anything. "Survived surgery. Pressure's stable." Owens closed her eyes again. Her face did something complicated and fast that she tried to keep controlled and didn't entirely manage to. And then she had it contained again. "Okay," she said. "Okay, good. You packed that wound on Sergeant Marsh well, considering what you had to work with. I had training." "You had training, and you used it when it was hard to use it. Those aren't the same thing." Emily leaned back against the wall. "How long have you been in?" 14 months. Emily thought about 14 months in, the specific kind of tired it produced. "You should eat something. Marcus knows where the good vending machine is." Owens turned her head to look at Emily. She had dark eyes that were currently doing the thing young medics' eyes did after their first serious field-to-hospital transition, taking inventory of what just happened, checking whether it was real. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why did you leave? The military?" Owens paused.
Commander Reed said you were one of the best trauma specialists the unit had. The handler said the same thing. Vic's handler, I mean. He knew about you. Emily was quiet for a moment. Do you want the official answer or the real one? Real one. I got tired of math where the numbers didn't add up to enough. She said it without bitterness, which took effort. Every field context has a resource ceiling. You hit it, and people are on the wrong side of it, and you do what you can, and sometimes what you can do isn't enough, and you carry the ones that weren't enough in a particular way that builds up over time. She paused. I wanted to work in a context where the ceiling was higher. Owens looked at her for a long moment. Is it? Here? Emily thought about room 714 and Darlene and the medication error she'd caught at 5:43 in the morning, and Victoria's formal notation and the congressional review and Reed's phone and Farwell's name. Some days, she said. She left Owens to find the vending machine and went to check on the two blast concussions who were in adjacent neuro rooms and who were both awake, both symptomatic, and both handling it with the grim stoicism of people who had decided that complaining was a luxury they hadn't budgeted for. She did neuro checks on both, finger tracking, light response, cognitive anchoring questions, and documented them on the ward tablet. One of them, a young woman named Specialist Adayaz Okoro, grabbed Emily's wrist as she was turning to go. Did Vic make it? Okoro's voice was rough. Blast concussion did that. The pressure wave rattled everything. He's out of surgery, Emily said. Stable. Okoro's grip loosened. She didn't let go entirely. She just held on, lightly, for another 3 seconds. Then she released Emily's wrist and turned her face toward the ceiling. Emily turned off the overhead light and left the door open 3 inches the way Okoro had asked for. Not dark, not bright, and stood in the corridor for a moment. It was past 10 o'clock. She had been on her feet for 17 hours. She could feel it in her lower back, and in the particular way the corridor lights had started to look slightly too vivid, the way everything looked when she was running on adrenaline and caffeine and not much else. She was going to have to deal with tomorrow. She turned toward the stairwell. She needed to write her shift notes, and she needed to check on Sergeant Marsh's wound dressing, and she needed to... She turned the corner and found Reed standing there with 2 cups of actual coffee, not dispensary machine coffee, and she stopped. Where did you get that? She said. There's a place 2 blocks over that closes at 11. He held one out. I asked one of my people to run. She took it. She drank it. It was good. She resented how much it helped. You should have gone back to the vehicles. My team's covered. He looked at her. The staffers are arriving at 8 in the morning. I got a notification 10 minutes ago. Emily absorbed that. Do they know I'm here? They know you were located. They don't know the full context of tonight. He paused. Emily, I need to brief you on what the committee is actually building. Not the outline I gave you earlier. The real shape of it. She looked at him. His face had the quality it got when he was managing information carefully. Not hiding it exactly, but organizing it, releasing it in an order that was strategic. She'd worked with him long enough to know the difference between that and deception. Tell me, she said. There's a staffer's named Bernard Coyle. He's been on this committee for 2 years. He's been specifically focused on forward medical unit decisions, casualty site protocols, triage call authority, what he's calling unauthorized command overreach. Meaning a medical specialist making calls that should have come from command. Meaning that, specifically Kessler Pass, specifically the decision to hold position. Emily's jaw tightened, barely. That decision kept 4 people alive. I know. If we'd moved on the original timeline, the ridge was compromised. We'd have moved directly into... I know, Reed said. I was there, Emily. I know what happened. His voice was steady, not defensive. Coyle knows too. He has the full operational report. He's choosing to focus on the authority question, not the outcome. Why? Reed looked at her for a moment. Because the outcome is harder to litigate. Because if he can establish that a specialist exceeded her authority in a high-pressure situation, regardless of whether the outcome was good,
He can use that to argue that the protocol structure around forward medical units needs to be restricted, which helps a position he's been building for 2 years. Emily heard it clearly. Not targeted at her specifically, targeted at something larger, and she was a useful piece of it. "What does he want from tomorrow?" she said. "A statement. On record." Reed met her eyes. "He's going to try to get you to characterize the Kessler Pass decision as something other than what it was." The coffee was warm in her hands. She looked down at it for a moment. "Then he's going to have a bad morning," she said. She went home at 11:15. Not to sleep. She didn't think sleep was going to happen in any meaningful way, but because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the hospital, even for a few hours. She lived 12 minutes away, in a second-floor apartment above a dry cleaner that had been there since before she was born. It was small and it was quiet, and it had exactly one picture on the wall, which was a photograph of a mountain range she'd never been able to identify, but had liked the shape of when she saw it in a second-hand store. She showered. She sat on the edge of her bed with wet hair and the Kessler Pass report open on her laptop. She'd requested and received a copy of the declassified version 6 weeks ago, when Farwell had first mentioned the committee review, and she'd read it twice and then put it away and tried not to think about it. She read it again now. The official language was dry, the way official language always was. It described the casualty site, the timeline, the resource assessment, the decision to hold position pending air support, the outcome. It didn't describe the cold. It didn't describe the sound that Private First Class Anthony Davils made before he didn't make any more sounds. It didn't describe what it felt like to recalculate every 4 hours, whether the math was still on the right side. She closed the laptop. She lay down without taking her shoes off and stared at the ceiling until her phone buzzed at 12:40 with a message from Patrice. "Vicks pressure holding. All 4 patients stable overnight. Good work tonight." She read it twice. Then she set the phone on the nightstand and closed her eyes. She thought she wouldn't sleep. She was wrong. She was back at Ravenwood at 7:10, and the 2 committee staffers were already there. She knew it before she saw them, the same way she'd known the day was going to go sideways when she first heard Rex's claws on the tile floor. A quality of wrongness in the atmosphere, a displacement in the lobby that had nothing to do with the medical convoy or the overnight patients. There was a specific way civilians with institutional authority moved through a space they didn't belong in, slightly too deliberate, slightly too observant, covering their discomfort with the posture of importance. There were 2 of them. Bernard Coyle was 50, gray-templed, in a charcoal suit that was good quality and slightly too formal for Cedar Falls in November. The woman beside him was younger, late 30s, with a messenger bag and a recorder already in her hand. They were talking to Victoria Hale. Emily stopped when she saw that. She was across the lobby, far enough away to observe before being observed, close enough to read body language. Victoria was upright and formal in the way she got when someone outranked her in a framework she understood. Coyle was talking. Victoria was nodding. The younger woman was watching the room. She saw Emily. Emily didn't alter her pace. She crossed the lobby at the same speed she'd entered it and came to stop beside the small group with her badge visible and her hands easy. "Mr. Coyle," she said. She'd looked him up last night, 3 hours before she found the sleep she wasn't expecting. "I'm Emily Carter." He turned. He was good. The slight surprise was managed quickly. "Miss Carter, we were just—" "I know why you're here," she said. "I'd rather do this somewhere other than the lobby." "Doctor, Hale, could we use conference room B?" Victoria looked between Emily and Coyle with an expression Emily couldn't quite place. "Of course," she said. They moved to conference room B. The younger staffer, she introduced herself as Nadia Voss, counsel to the committee, set her recorder on the table and a legal pad beside it. Coyle sat across from Emily. He had a folder. He opened it with the unhurried deliberation of someone who wanted you to think about what might be in it before he chose to show you. Emily put her hands flat on the table and waited. "Ms. Carter, thank you for making time this morning." His voice was measured, cordial, with the specific quality of cordiality that is a working tool rather than a feeling. "As I'm sure Commander Reed has briefed you, The committee is reviewing operational records from forward medical units active between 4 and 6 years ago. Your service record has come up in the context of 3 operational reports. I know which 3, Emily said. Then you know the committee has questions about certain decisions made during the Kessler Pass operation. The decision to hold the casualty site. Specifically, the authority under which that decision was made. Emily looked at him. I made it. Coyle made a small note. On what authority? Medical authority. I was the senior trauma specialist on site. The projected casualties from moving on the original timeline exceeded the projected casualties from holding. The projected casualties, Coyle repeated, meaning your assessment. Meaning the assessment I made based on the information available? Yes. And that assessment overrode the movement order. The movement order was suspended pending confirmation from command. I recommended the suspension. The commanding officer on site made the final call. Coyle looked at his folder. Captain D. Farrow. Yes. Who is no longer active? Correct. He turned a page. The committee's reading of the operational report suggests that the suspension recommendation was made before Captain Farrow was consulted, that the site was effectively held for 14 hours before command was notified. Emily heard exactly what he was doing. She held his gaze. The communication window was compromised, radio blackout for 11 hours due to terrain interference. When communication was restored, the situation was briefed to command immediately. 11 hours is a significant window. It was not a choice. It was a condition of the terrain. Coyle made another note. The committee will want to verify the communication logs. The communication logs are in the operational report, all of them. Emily kept her voice even. Mr. Coyle, I've read the committee's framing of this review. I understand the position you're building. I'll answer your questions honestly and completely, and I'd like to do that on record. She looked at the recorder on the table. Is that running? Nadia Voss looked at Coyle. Coyle looked at Emily. Not yet, he said. Turn it on, Emily said. A pause. Coyle nodded to Voss. The recorder light went red. Good, Emily said. Let's start from the beginning. And she started talking. Methodically, precisely. In the sequence of events that she had never told anyone outside of the operational debrief 4 years ago, because no one outside of that debrief had been entitled to it. She talked about the ridge assessment, about the compromised radio, about the triage decision she'd made over those 11 hours with the supplies she had. She talked about Kessler Pass in the specific language of what actually happened, which was the hardest language to use because it was the one she'd been protecting herself from for 4 years. She was 40 minutes in, and Coyle was leaning forward now in a way that was no longer the posture of a man running a process, when the door to conference room B opened. Commander Reed came in. Behind him was a woman Emily hadn't seen in 4 years. Colonel Doris Farwell was 61 and looked like someone had assembled her from raw material designed to be difficult to move, compact, angular, with close-cropped white hair and eyes that had the quality of instruments rather than features. She wore civilian clothes. She carried a leather portfolio that was older than Victoria Hale's and had seen considerably more use. She looked at Emily. Something crossed her face that was too small and too fast to name. Then she looked at Coyle. Mr. Coyle, she said, but I believe you've been expecting me. Coyle's color shifted. It was a small shift, barely visible, but Emily had been watching his face for the last 40 minutes, and she caught it. Colonel Farwell, he said, I wasn't aware you'd be... I know you weren't. Farwell set her portfolio on the table. I reviewed the notification your office sent to this hospital this morning. The committee requested a statement from Ms. Carter without notifying her legal rights under the Declassification Review Act, which requires a minimum of 72 hours notice and the presence of a designated advocate when a classified operational record is the subject of inquiry. She opened the portfolio and placed a document on the table in front of Coyle. This proceeding is improper. Everything recorded in the last 40 minutes is inadmissible to the committee's record. The room went very still. Coyle looked at the document. He looked at Farwell. He looked at Emily, and for the first time since he'd sat down across from her, his expression was the honest one. Emily looked back at him and said nothing. Then Farwell turned to her, and her voice dropped the institutional register entirely and became something quieter and more direct. I should have called you before I filed the declassification. I made a unilateral decision about your record, and I didn't ask you first. A pause. That was wrong. Emily held her gaze. She didn't say it was fine because it wasn't fine. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down. It was Patrice. Vic's awake. Asking for you. Emily read it twice. Then she looked up at Farwell, at Reed, at Coyle, at the recorder with its red light still burning. I need to go check on a patient, she said. She stood up and she walked out of conference room B, and behind her she heard Farwell say to Coyle, in a voice that carried even through a closing door, Mr. Coyle, I'd suggest you cancel whatever you had planned for this morning, because we are going to go through every line of every operational report your committee has been misreading, and we're going to do it correctly this time. Emily walked down the corridor toward the recovery ward, and for the first time since Rex had pressed his head against her knee in the early morning dark, something inside her chest loosened by exactly 1 degree. She didn't let herself feel it yet, but she noted it. She pushed open the door to post-surgical recovery and found Vic awake, pale, and hooked to enough monitoring equipment to run a small vehicle, with the alert, slightly bewildered expression of someone who had been unconscious for 12 hours and was still catching up with where he was. He looked at her. His voice came out rough and thin. You, Carter? Yes, she said. He tried to say something else and didn't quite manage it. He reached out instead, and she stepped forward and let him grip her wrist, and she stood there while he held on and got his bearings. The monitor above his bed traced his heartbeat in steady green peaks. From down the corridor she heard voices, multiple, overlapping, the sound of something that had been carefully contained starting to come apart at its seams. She recognized one of the voices as Victoria Hale's, and another that she didn't recognize at all. The voices were coming from the direction of the main corridor, just past the nursing station, and Emily recognized the register of Victoria's voice before she could make out the words. That particular pitch Victoria used when she was performing authority for an audience while also trying to contain something she hadn't planned for. Emily told Vic she'd be back. He was already drifting again, the grip on her wrist loosening as his body pulled him back under. She eased his hand down to the blanket and stepped out of recovery. The main corridor was crowded in a way it hadn't been 10 minutes ago. There were 4 people Emily didn't recognize standing near the nursing station. 2 in civilian clothes, 1 in a county sheriff's uniform, 1 in what she identified as a compliance investigator's badge on a lanyard. They had the grouped, slightly uncomfortable posture of people who had arrived together and were now waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Victoria was facing them with her hands clasped in front of her portfolio, and the expression she was wearing was the one Emily had glimpsed last night in the trauma bay, the one that didn't have a clean name, that sat between calculation and the first stages of genuine alarm. Angela Park was 3 steps behind Victoria. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Warren Finch was near the wall with his arms crossed, watching. Emily came to stand beside him. "What happened?" she said quietly. "Not sure yet." He kept his eyes on the group. "The one with the badge is from the State Health Oversight Office. Showed up about 6 minutes ago. The other civilian is from the hospital board." He paused. "They came together." "The board doesn't operate like that," Emily said. "No," Warren agreed. "They don't." Emily watched Victoria for another moment. Then she looked at the compliance investigator, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on his head, a tablet in one hand and a brown envelope in the other. He had the organized, slightly weary look of a man who had done this kind of thing many times and found no particular satisfaction in it. He opened the envelope. He handed Victoria a document. Victoria took it. She read it. The thing that happened to her face was not dramatic. It wasn't a flinch or a visible collapse, but it was real, and Emily, watching from 15 feet away, saw exactly the moment it landed. She looked at Warren. "I need to go back to conference room B." "Reed's still in there," he said. "And Farwell." "I know." She walked back down the corridor, past the pharmacy window where Janet was watching the nursing station crowd with the resigned attention of someone who had worked in hospitals long enough to know that clusters of suits near administrative staff meant something had broken open. Emily pushed open the door to conference room B. Farwell was standing. Coyle was still seated, but his folder was closed now,
and his hands were flat on the table in a posture that had stopped performing authority and was just occupying space. Nadia Voss had turned the recorder off at some point and was writing on her legal pad with the focused attention of someone who was drafting rather than noting, constructing rather than recording. Reed was near the window. They all looked at Emily when she came in. "Something's happening at the nursing station," she said. "State health oversight and someone from the board. They came together." She looked at Farwell. "Do you know about that?" Farwell held her gaze. "I made some calls last night." Emily absorbed that. "What calls?" "The committee review isn't the only thing that brought me to Cedar Falls." Farwell set her hands on the back of a chair. "Your record being declassified made your name searchable in a broader system. I ran a check 3 days ago. Your employment file at this hospital came up in a separate inquiry, a complaint filed 8 weeks ago by a former staff member about administrative conduct. The complaint was filed with the State Oversight Board and had been sitting in a queue." A pause. "I flagged it for priority review." The room was very quiet. "Who filed the complaint?" Emily said. "A nurse named Diane Petro. She left Ravenwood 6 months ago. The complaint covers a pattern of behavior by the hospital director going back 2 years. Targeted documentation reviews, selective enforcement of protocol, a practice of using formal notations to build termination cases against staff members she wanted gone." Farwell's voice was precise and without inflection. "The notation from your file yesterday was the 5th in 12 weeks. Emily stood very still. She thought about the 4 o'clock meeting. The document turned face down on the table before she arrived. Angela Park's eyes finding the middle distance. "Angela knew," she said. "Angela Park filed a supporting statement with the Oversight Board 3 weeks ago," Farwell said, "anonymously. The board investigator identified the source when they ran the employment records." Emily thought about Angela in conference room B yesterday afternoon, the posture of a woman who was doing something she'd been told to do and hated herself for it. The half-second of eye contact, the careful study of the table surface. Not complicity, not exactly. Something more complicated than that and less forgivable at the same time. "The board member," Emily said. "Is he here to support Victoria or to act?" "The board convened an emergency session at 7 this morning," Farwell said. "I was invited to provide context regarding the nature of Ms. Carter's service record and the implications of using unverified protocol complaints to build a personnel case against someone with a classified employment history." She paused. They found the context relevant. Coyle, who had been silent through all of this, made a sound, not a word, more of a considered exhale. He looked at Emily. He had, in the past 30 minutes, stopped performing and was now simply sitting in a room where something had happened that was larger than what he'd come to manage. "Ms. Carter," he said, "the committee's interest in your record, I want to be clear that the intent was—" "I know what the intent was," Emily said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "You needed a case study for a structural argument. I understand. What I'd like you to understand is that the decisions made at Kessler Pass kept 4 people alive and cost me one who I still think about, and characterizing them as unauthorized overreach is not a reading of the record that the full record supports." She held his gaze. "If the committee wants my cooperation going forward, I'll give it, but it's going to be on the same terms as the last 40 minutes, on record, accurate, and complete." Coyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Reed, by the window, said nothing. But she felt him. But what happened in the main corridor over the next hour was the institutional equivalent of a controlled demolition, slow enough to watch, fast enough to be irreversible. The compliance investigator's name was Gerald Thorne. He had worked for the State Health Oversight Board for 19 years, and he handled the conversation with Victoria Hale the way a man handles a piece of equipment that needs to be operated precisely because any deviation from the correct sequence would cause it to blow. He was courteous. He was specific. He asked Victoria to confirm facts rather than explain them, which was the technique of someone who already had the documentation and was establishing on record whether she'd contradict it. Emily was not part of that conversation. She was at the nursing station, updating Vic's overnight chart and beginning the shift documentation she owed from the night before, and she could see the conversation happening 20 feet away in the way you can see weather through a window.
its shape and movement visible, its sound muted. Angela Park came to stand beside her at some point. She stood there for a moment without speaking. "I should have told you," Angela said finally. Emily kept writing. "Told me what specifically?" "About the documentation flags. That she'd been asking me to compile them, going back." Angela's voice was low and careful, in the way of someone choosing words, because the available words weren't any of them good enough. "It started before you. There was a nurse in Ward 5, Petro, and before her a charge nurse on the night rotation." She stopped. "I filed the statement because I didn't know what else to do. But I should have told you directly." Emily finished the line she was writing. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was scared." Angela said it plainly, without softening it into something more professional. "I have 2 kids and a mortgage and a job I can't afford to lose. And I told myself the statement would be enough." A pause. "It wasn't." Emily looked at her. Angela's face was tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that they'd forgotten what it felt like to not carry it. "Is your name on the statement?" Emily said. "Thorne identified me." "Then it's going to come out." "I know." Angela nodded once, tight. "I know." Emily considered her for a moment. Not the formal, managed consideration of a colleague, something more honest than that, more uncomfortable. Angela had known. She'd built the paper case, and she'd filed the supporting statement, and she'd been the one to come to Emily's room yesterday afternoon with the clipboard and the apologetic posture, and none of those 3 things were entirely reconcilable with each other. "You did file the statement," Emily said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," Emily said. "I'm not saying it's worth everything, but it's worth something." Angela absorbed that and walked away, and Emily went back to her documentation. At 10:30, the board member, his name was Arthur Del Vecchio, 62, with the composed, permanent tension of someone who had spent 20 years overseeing an institution through other people's crises, asked to use Victoria's office. Not as a courtesy, as a direction. Victoria went with him. Thorne followed. Emily watched them cross the lobby and disappear through the administrative corridor doors. Reed, who had come to stand near the dispensary at some point, watched beside her. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on what they find in those files." Reed kept his voice low. "Farwell sent the Oversight Board 3 years of employment records last night. Terminations, voluntary departures, formal notations. The pattern, if there is one, will be visible in the data." "There's a pattern," Emily said. She said it without satisfaction. She'd read the shape of it herself in the past 2 hours. Not from files she had access to, but from the way the pieces fit. Petro, who'd left 6 months ago. The night rotation charge nurse. The 5 notations in 12 weeks. She was building cases, methodically. People she wanted out. People she perceived as either a liability or a challenge, Reed said. That's how Farwell described it. Emily thought about Victoria in the trauma bay last night, standing near the wall, watching, with the expression she hadn't been able to name. She thought about the moment in the lobby when the whole building had been listening and Victoria had said, "You are a floor nurse. You do not issue orders in this hospital," and about the 4 seconds of silence before Warren had moved. She thought about the fact that Victoria had come back to the empty trauma bay afterward. About the word revisit. "She's not a simple person," Emily said. Reed looked at her. "She's wrong," Emily said. "What she was doing was wrong, and it needs to stop, and the people she pushed out deserved better. I'm not revising that." She paused. "But she's not simple." Reed was quiet for a moment. "No, she's not." Vic was more awake by 11. He was still pale, still running the careful movements of a man whose body had recently been opened and repaired, and was registering its opinion about that, but his eyes were tracking properly, and his voice had gotten stronger. Emily did a brief assessment, BP, lung sounds, incision check with the attending on rotation, a brief neuroscreen because blast proximity was a secondary concern she hadn't ruled out, and sat in the chair beside his bed when she was finished. "Your medic," she said. "Owens." "Owens is good," Vic said. His voice was still rough. "She kept you together on the road." 4 hours is a long time. Vic was quiet for a moment. His head turned on the pillow so he was looking at the ceiling. I know I almost didn't make it. You almost didn't. He appreciated that. She could see it. The way people who've been near something serious appreciate being told the truth about it, rather than insulated from it. The commander said you were the one who set everything up. Here, before we arrived. I knew what was coming. He said you used to work K9. He looked at her. Rex found you. Rex found me. Vic was quiet again, then carefully. He's okay? He's not. He's fine. He's been in the staff lounge all morning. Marcus has been feeding him things he probably shouldn't be eating. Something in Vic's face relaxed, a specific tension around his eyes that had been there since she walked in and that only released with that information. She recognized it. She'd seen it before in people who'd worked with dogs long enough that the dog's welfare was tied to their own in a way that wasn't sentimental, just true. He remembered you, Vic said. From before. He's a good dog, Emily said. He remembers things that matter. She left Vic to rest and went to check on Okoro and the second concussion patient, specialist Luis Barrero, who was sitting up in bed eating from a lunch tray with the focused intensity of a man who had been told he needed calories and had decided to treat it like an assignment. He gave her a 3-word status report: headache, better, hungry. She updated his chart, ordered an imaging follow-up for 48 hours, and moved on. She was back at the nursing station by 11:30 when Warren found her. He looked like a man carrying news with both hands. Del Vecchio came out of Victoria's office 20 minutes ago, he said. Thorne has the files. They've been in there since 10:30. Emily kept writing. I know. There's going to be an announcement. Del Vecchio told Patricia and admin that the board is convening a full review and that there will be interim administrative changes effective. He checked his watch. Apparently this afternoon. Emily stopped writing. Interim. He used the word suspension, Warren said. Administrative suspension pending review. Victoria will be asked to step back from operational responsibilities while the oversight process runs. The word suspension sat in the room between them. Emily thought about 14 months of Victoria Hale. The heels on the tile floor, the portfolio never opened, the meetings scheduled at inconvenient times, the phrases deployed like instruments. Your position here, protocol deviation, not the point. She thought about the nurses who'd left, about the shapes of careers redirected or ended by a pattern of paperwork that looked like administration and functioned like pressure. Okay, she said. Okay. Warren studied her. You don't look like someone who just won something. I don't feel like someone who won something. She picked up the pen again. I feel like someone who's been awake for over 20 hours and has 4 patients to finish documenting. Warren sat down in the adjacent chair. Finch, senior attending covering your documentation. Carter, what do you actually feel? She considered refusing the question. Then, tired, she said. Mostly tired. And she stopped, started again. I built this life specifically to be away from the kind of thing that's been happening here for the last 24 hours. And it followed me anyway. And I'm trying to figure out whether that means I built it wrong or whether that's just how it is, how things are. Warren was quiet. He didn't try to answer it, which was the correct response. I have good patience, Emily said. Darlene's going to see her daughter Thursday. Vic's going to recover. Okoro and Barrero are going to be okay. She looked at the charts in front of her. That part is still true. Yeah, Warren said. It is. He covered 2 of her charts without being asked. Dot. At 1:15, Gerald Thorne came to find Emily. He found her in the corridor outside Ward 7, and he stopped her with the quiet directness of a man who didn't waste approach time. Miss Carter, do you have a few minutes? She did. They stood in the alcove near the supply room, the same one she'd stood in yesterday afternoon after conference room B, after Victoria's measured words about your position here. Thorne had his tablet and the brown envelope, which was now thick with additional paper. I need to tell you what we found, he said. Not all of it, but the part that's directly relevant to you. All right. He opened the tablet. The documentation review going back 30 months shows a consistent pattern of targeted notation against specific staff members, 7 in total, including you. The pattern in each case involves a period of increased administrative scrutiny, a compilation of minor protocol deviations, and a scheduled formal notation meeting. He looked up at her. In 6 of the 7 cases, the staff member resigned within 8 weeks of the first formal notation. 6 out of 7. Emily thought about Petro, about the night rotation charge nurse, about 5 people she didn't know, whose names were in a file, who had left the jobs they'd built because the pressure had made staying feel impossible. You were the 7th, Thorne said. She already knew that. Hearing it stated plainly was different from knowing it. The board has suspended Dr. Hale effective 2 o'clock today, pending a full administrative review, Thorne continued. That review will include an examination of whether the termination by attrition pattern constitutes a violation of the state's medical workplace protection statutes. He paused. It likely does. Likely, Emily said. The standard for a finding is a preponderance of evidence. The pattern is documented. Farwell's supplementary materials regarding your specific record, the classified employment history, the nature of the work you did, are part of the case for aggravated improper conduct. Using a personnel mechanism to push out a staff member with a protected employment history is a more serious violation than the baseline. He let that land. She would not have known about the protected history, but that doesn't change what the mechanism was. Emily thought about that. Victoria hadn't known. Had built her case in the dark against someone whose actual record she couldn't see, on the assumption that the person she was looking at was exactly what she appeared to be, a floor nurse who made margin notations and came in early without scheduling it, and occasionally pushed back in ways that Victoria found inconvenient. She hadn't been wrong about any of those things. She'd just been wrong about everything underneath them. What happens to the 6 people who left? Emily asked. Thorne's expression shifted, not towards something softer exactly, but towards something more careful. The review can recommend remediation. In practice, that means letters of record correction, formal apology from the institution, and in some cases financial settlement. Whether that process moves forward depends on whether those individuals choose to participate. He paused. They'll be notified. Emily nodded. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Thorne said. On the record or off? She thought about it. The medication error I caught in room 714 the morning before yesterday, at 5:43 before my scheduled shift. It was a 40 milligram discrepancy in the metoclopramide dosage. I flagged it in the system and wrote a margin note for the incoming nurse. That notation was cited in my formal meeting as a protocol violation. She looked at him evenly. I'd like that specific flag removed from my file. Thorne wrote it down. Considered. And the patient in 714, his name is Harold Metz, he's 67, deserves to know that someone was looking out for him. That's a matter for his care team. I know, Emily said. I'm his care team. Thorne looked at her for a moment, and something in his professionally neutral face loosened by a degree. Off the record, Ms. Carter. Coming in at 5:43 to catch a 40 milligram discrepancy that nobody else caught? That's exactly what a good nurse does. I know, she said again. He nodded and walked away. At 1:58, 2 minutes before the suspension was officially effective, Victoria Hale came to find Emily. Emily was at the nursing station. She'd been there for 20 minutes, genuinely working, Darlene's 2 o'clock BP check, Vic's next fluid assessment, the neuro follow-up schedule for Okoro and Barreiro, and she had the particular focused stillness of someone who had been awake for a very long time and had found, in the work itself, the only reliable surface to stand on. Victoria came down the corridor without her heels this time. She'd changed shoes at some point, practical flats, the kind that didn't announce themselves, and the difference was audible. She stopped at the edge of the nursing station. She didn't step into it. Emily looked up. Victoria was holding her portfolio. She looked like herself and also like something was different. The specific quality of a face that has been organizing itself around a performance for long enough that when the performance stops, the face doesn't quite know what to return to. I owe you an apology, Victoria said. Emily waited. I know what that sounds like right now. With Thorne and Del Vecchio and all of it, I know it sounds like... Victoria stopped, restarted. I want you to know that I'm saying this separately from whatever is happening administratively, because you deserve to hear it separately. Emily looked at her. She thought about what she'd said to Reed that morning. She's not a simple person. And she thought about the fact that being not simple was not the same as being good, and that the apology in front of her was real and also insufficient, and also the only thing available. I judged you before I knew your story, Victoria said. I built a case out of paperwork because I found you inconvenient, and that was wrong. Not procedurally wrong. Wrong. She said the last word like it had weight to it, like she'd had to find it in a place she didn't usually go. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, the 6 people who left before me, when the review finds them, and it will find them, I'd like you to reach out, not a letter, a call. Victoria blinked. She had not been expecting that. That's what the apology should cost, Emily said. Not me, them. Victoria looked at her for a long moment. I can do that, she said quietly. I know you can, Emily said. Whether you do is up to you. She turned back to her charts. Victoria stood there for another few seconds, and then she walked away. And Emily heard the soft sound of those unannounced shoes moving down the corridor and turning the corner and disappearing. Warren appeared from around the pharmacy window. He'd been close enough to hear. He looked at Emily with the expression of someone who'd spent 40 years developing the ability to assess situations accurately and was currently updating his assessment. That was... he started. I know, Emily said. I was going to say formidable. I know. He handed her a coffee. Dispensary machine. She took it because the alternative was nothing, and nothing wasn't an option. She was on her 3rd chart when Farwell appeared in the corridor. Farwell's presence anywhere had a quality to it. Not loud, not demanding, but definite, the way a fixed point is definite. She came to stand beside the nursing station and waited until Emily looked up. Coyle's submitting a revised framing to the committee, she said. The Kessler pass record will be entered as a demonstration of correct field judgment under communication blackout conditions, not as a case study in overreach. Emily absorbed that. And the other 2 reports. Consistent with the revised framing. Farwell paused. It won't come out publicly. The declassification protects your record from being misused, but the review itself will remain internal to the committee. Which means nobody here finds out what's in it. Correct. Farwell met her eyes. Unless you choose to tell them. Emily looked down at the chart in front of her. She thought about the weight of that choice, the protected history, the reasons she'd built the smaller life, the reasons that life had turned out to be not quite as sealed as she'd constructed it to be. She thought about Vic, pale in the recovery bed, asking if Rex was okay. She thought about what Owens had said on the phone. He said if we routed through Cedar Falls, to trust whatever you said. She thought about Rex pressing his head against her knee in the empty corridor at 6 a.m. I'll think about it, she said. Farwell nodded, which was her version of take whatever time you need. She was turning to go when Emily said her name. Farwell turned back. Before you filed the declassification, Emily said, the next time there's a decision that involves my record, ask me first. Farwell held her gaze. A long moment passed. Yes, she said, just that. No qualification. She left. Emily went back to her charts. She was finishing Darlene's 2:00 notation when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Local Cedar Falls area code. No name. This is Diane Petro. I heard what happened today. I just wanted to say thank you. I know you don't know me, but I think you might understand what the last 6 months have been like. If you're ever willing to talk, no pressure. I'd like to. Emily read it twice. She thought about 7 people, herself and 6 others, and about Thorne's word, remediation. She thought about the shape of what had been built against them, methodical and patient, operating just below the threshold of what was visible. She started to type a reply. Then she stopped. From down the corridor, she heard Marcus's voice, urgent, not panicked, but urgent in the specific way she'd learned to read across 17 hours and a career's worth of emergency rooms and staging areas. Emily, room 714. She was already moving before he finished the sentence, and she was moving fast, and the chart she'd been writing in was still open on the desk behind her. She pushed through the door to 714 and stopped. Harold Metz, 67, 3 days post-surgical, was sitting upright in his bed. His face had the tight, gray quality of someone in acute distress. His breathing was fast and labored. The monitoring equipment was alarming, a sound she'd been hearing for 36 hours and that hadn't once pointed to this room until right now. And standing at the foot of his bed, with a look on her face that Emily had never seen before, was a woman she'd never seen before. Young, mid-20s, wearing a coat still cold from outside, who had clearly just arrived and was clearly the daughter Darlene had told her wasn't supposed to know about the surgery. Except Darlene was 6'2". This was 7'14". This woman was Harold Metz's daughter. Emily crossed to the bedside. She checked the monitor. She put 2 fingers on Harold's wrist and felt what the monitor was already telling her. And she turned to the door and called Warren's name in the tone that meant now, not in a moment, now. And then she turned back to the young woman at the foot of the bed, who was shaking. "I just got here," the woman said. I didn't know he was sick. Nobody called me. What's your name?" Emily said. Kira Metz. He's my dad." Kira. Emily kept her voice level. "I need you to step back 1 step and let me work. I'm going to take care of him. Can you do that?" Kira stepped back. Her hands were over her mouth. Emily turned to Harold and started working, and Warren came through the door 30 seconds later, and the room became what rooms like this became. Fast, specific, the controlled urgency of people who knew what they were doing and were doing it. And in the middle of it, Emily did not think about Victoria Hale or Bernard Coyle or Doris Farwell or the formal notation or Kessler Pass. She thought only about Harold Metz, 67 years old, whose medication discrepancy she had caught at 5:43 in the morning 2 days ago, and whose breathing was now telling her something she needed to hear and respond to correctly and quickly, because correct and quickly were the only 2 things that mattered in this room. Warren looked up from the monitor and met her eyes. She already knew what he was going to say. "Pulmonary," he said. "I know," she said. "Get Yates." Yates came in 4 minutes. 4 minutes was fast. It didn't feel fast inside room 714, where Harold Metz's oxygen saturation was dropping and his breathing had taken on the specific labored quality of lungs working against something they couldn't clear. But Emily had been in enough rooms like this to know that fast and feeling fast were different measurements, and she kept her hands steady and her voice steady and let the difference between those 2 things be somebody else's problem. She'd already started the intervention sequence, supplemental oxygen, positioning, the preliminary assessment she could run without imaging because she'd learned in a different context to read a body the way some people read maps, by the shape of the terrain rather than the labels on it. Warren was on the phone getting respiratory on the line. Kira Metz was in the corridor because Emily had asked her, firmly and not unkindly, to step out. And she had. When Yates came through the door, she came in the same controlled runway she'd come last night. Not sprinting, never sprinting. And she took the handoff from Emily in 3 seconds, assessed in 30, and made the call. "Pulmonary embolism," Yates said. "We need imaging to confirm, but we're treating now." She looked at Emily. "You started the O2 4 minutes ago." "Good." Yates was already moving. "I want a CT angio and anticoagulation protocol running, and someone needs to talk to the family." Emily turned for the door. "Carter?" Yates's voice stopped her. "You found this how?" "I checked on him this morning," Emily said. "His color wasn't right." Yates looked at her over the controlled chaos of the room, the respiratory tech arriving, Warren reading out the phone orders, the monitor's insistent sound. And something passed across her face that wasn't surprise and wasn't quite acknowledgement either, but sat somewhere between them. "Go talk to the family," she said. Emily went. Kira Metz was in the corridor with her coat still on and her hands clasped in front of her, doing the thing that families did outside rooms like 714, standing very still, as if movement might use up something they needed to save. She was 24 or 25, with her father's jaw and a kind of held quality to her face That meant she'd been scared for a while and was managing it by not letting it move. Emily came to stand in front of her. She didn't start with "I have good news" or "try not to worry," because both were premature and one was potentially a lie. And lying to a person while they were standing outside their father's room was the kind of thing Emily had a low tolerance for. "Your father had a blood clot moved to his lung," she said. "It's serious. Dr. Yates is treating him right now, and treatment started early, which matters. The next 30 minutes will tell us a lot about how he responds." Kira's clasped hands tightened. "Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know yet," Emily said. "I wish I could tell you something cleaner than that. I can't." Kira looked at her. Her eyes were filling and she was fighting it, and Emily didn't look away from that fight because looking away would have been easier, but easier wasn't what this moment was for. "I didn't know he was sick," Kira said. "He didn't tell me. I came because I hadn't heard from him in a week, and that's not... He always calls." Her voice broke at the edges, and she caught it. "I drove 3 hours." "He told one of our nurses he didn't want to worry you," Emily said. Kira made a sound, half exhale, half something that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's him. That's exactly him." "He was trying to protect you," Emily said. "It was the wrong call, but it came from the right place." Kira looked at her for a moment. "Are you his nurse?" "Yes," Emily said. "I've been watching his chart since he came in 3 days ago." "Were you the one who caught the... He mentioned something when I talked to him yesterday. He said a nurse found an error in his medication. He said..." Kira stopped. Restarted. "He said she came in before her shift to check on him." Emily didn't answer that directly. "Let's focus on right now," she said. "I'll come back as soon as there's something definite to tell you. There's a family room at the end of this corridor. Can I walk you there?" Kira nodded. She walked like someone moving through water, present but resistance heavy, the specific movement of a person carrying the weight of what they don't yet know. Emily walked her to the family room and came back to the corridor and stood outside 714 for a moment, listening to the sound of Yates's team working, and let herself feel the particular suspended dread of waiting to find out which way something would go. She had felt it at Kessler Pass for 72 hours. She knew how to carry it. "Down." Harold Metz responded to treatment. Not instantly, not cleanly. The first 20 minutes were the kind of 20 minutes that made experienced medical staff quiet and focused in the specific way that means nobody is comfortable yet. But his saturation began climbing at the 23-minute mark, and by the time the CT angio confirmed what Yates had called clinically, the anticoagulation protocol was working, and his breathing had eased from the labored shallowness of an hour ago to something that was still monitored and still concerning, but was heading in the right direction. Yates came out of the room at 3:40. "He's stabilizing," she said. "We'll watch him closely for the next 12 hours. If the trajectory holds, he's going to be okay." She looked at Emily. "You said his color wasn't right this morning." "It wasn't. You were watching for complications from the medication discrepancy." "I was watching him," Emily said. "The discrepancy was 3 days ago. I keep track of patients who've had close calls." Yates was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been on shift?" "Since yesterday morning." Yates's expression moved into something that was both reproving and not, in the way of a person who understood exactly why and couldn't pretend to disagree with it. "Go home after you talk to the family," she said. "That's a directive, not a suggestion." Emily went to find Kira. She told her what Yates had said. Stabilizing, close watch, trajectory improving, and she watched the specific thing that happened to Kira's face when the weight shifted from not knowing to knowing something bearable. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like the moment when you've been holding your breath for so long that releasing it actually hurts. "Can I see him?" Kira said. "In about 30 minutes. They need to settle him first." Kira nodded. Then after a moment, "The nurse, who came in early. That was you." Emily didn't answer. "I'm going to find out," Kira said. There was nothing aggressive in it, just a statement of fact from a woman who had driven 3 hours because her father always called, and this week he hadn't. Emily looked at her. "Take care of him," she said. "That's what matters." She walked back to the nursing station. She wrote her notes. She was 2/3 through the last chart when Warren appeared, set both hands on the edge of the desk, and said, "Carter, What time did you start your shift yesterday? 4:30, she said. It is now 4:15 in the afternoon. He looked at her steadily. That's 36 hours. I know. Yates told you to go home. I have 2 more charts. I have 2 hands and medical credentials, Warren said. Go home. She looked up at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was not particularly interested in debating it. She pushed the charts toward him. He took them. She found Reed in the lobby, near the windows, with his coat on. 2 of his convoy vehicles were still outside. The other 2 had departed at some point during the afternoon. Rex was beside him, sitting with the upright patience of a dog, who had been waiting and considered waiting to be a reasonable use of time. When Rex saw Emily, his tail went sideways once. Then he stood up and pressed the top of his head against her palm. She crouched down and held his face between her hands for a moment. He looked at her with his dark, serious eyes, and she looked back, and they stayed like that for a few seconds, which was enough. She stood up. Vic's stabilizing, she told Reed. Okoro and Barreiro are cleared for transfer to a military facility tomorrow if you want to move them. Marsh's wound is clean, no infection. Reed nodded. I know, I got the updates. He paused. I'm not asking about the patients, Emily. She looked at him. I'm fine. You've been on for 36 hours. Yates already gave me this speech. Warren too. Then you should be convinced by now. He studied her. Farwell's heading back tonight. She wanted me to tell you, the committee review will take 6 to 8 weeks. You'll be contacted through official channels, not through her. He paused. She also wanted me to tell you she means what she said, about asking first. Emily thought about Farwell's face when she'd said yes, the weight of a person accepting a correction they knew they'd earned. I know she does, she said. That's the thing about Farwell. She means everything she says. The problem is, she says things unilaterally and means them afterward. Reed's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's accurate. Emily looked out the lobby windows at the parking lot, the gray November afternoon, the 2 remaining vehicles, the dry cleaner 2 blocks from her apartment that had been there since before she was born. What happens to Rex, she said. That's partially why I'm still here. Reed reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He held it out. Emily took it. He's 2 months from mandatory retirement, age and the leg. He looked at the dog. He needs a handler who understands his medical history and knows his protocols, someone he trusts. Emily looked at the envelope. She knew what was in it before she opened it. The shape of it was familiar, the institutional weight of a form that asked a specific question and waited for a specific answer. Adoption transfer request. Her name was already on it. You filled out my name, she said. Farwell did, Reed said. She said to tell you that this one she did ask about, just not directly. Emily looked at Rex. Rex looked at her with the expression of a dog who had already made his position on the matter very clear, had pressed it against her knee at 6 in the morning, and was now simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She folded the envelope and put it in her scrub pocket. Tell her I'll think about it, Emily said. Reed looked at her. He could read her well enough to know what I'll think about it meant when she said it in that tone. I'll tell her, he said. He put out his hand. She shook it, the specific handshake of people who had been through something serious together, once before and now again, which was different from a normal handshake in ways that were hard to describe but immediately legible to anyone who'd experienced it. Take care of yourself, Emily, he said. I do, she said. I'm just not always doing it at times that are convenient for other people. He laughed, a real one, short, the kind that surprised the person it came from. Then he walked toward the lobby doors, and she watched him go. Said. The board's official announcement came the following morning, but the information had already moved through Ravenwood the way information always moved through hospitals, faster than any official channel, carried in the margins of conversations in the break room and the brief exchanges at the nursing station, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a place when something significant has changed. Victoria Hale's administrative suspension was effective immediately, pending the full oversight review. Arthur Del Vecchio would serve as interim administrator. The announcement used careful, institutional language that said everything and nothing simultaneously, in the way that official announcements did, but everyone in the building could read the shape of what it described. The Oversight Board's preliminary findings, released 3 days later, and which Emily read on her phone during her lunch break on Ward 7, were more specific. A pattern of targeted administrative conduct affecting 7 staff members over a 30-month period. Practices inconsistent with the state's medical workplace protection statutes. Recommendation for formal disciplinary proceedings and mandatory review of all personnel actions taken during the identified period. 7 names. 6 of them were people Emily had never met, whose exits from Ravenwood she'd known nothing about, who had simply been gone by the time she arrived. The 7th was hers. She read the document twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on Darlene in 624, who was having lunch and who had, as predicted, been hovered over thoroughly since Thursday by a daughter who turned out to be an architect from Columbus, and who had been slightly more tearful about the unexpected hospital stay than Darlene had wanted, but also, according to Darlene, exactly what she'd needed. She stayed 2 nights, Darlene told Emily. Slept in that chair. She pointed at the family chair with an expression that was trying to be exasperated and not quite making it. How do you feel about that? Emily said. I feel like my back hurts less and I'm less scared, Darlene said, which is embarrassing. It's not, Emily said. It's just true. Darlene looked at her for a moment. I heard about everything that happened here, while I was in this room, not knowing. She shook her head. I want you to know, when I first came in, 3 days ago, you were the one who sat with me. When I was scared and trying not to show it. She paused. I don't think you knew how much that meant. Emily wrote the last notation in the chart. I'm glad you're getting better, Darlene. That's not an answer, Darlene said. Emily looked up at her. I know it mattered, she said. I just don't always know how to receive that when people say it. Darlene held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a 62-year-old woman who had been around long enough to recognize the shape of something a person needed to hear and say it anyway. Practice, she said. That's all it is. You practice receiving it until it doesn't feel like a threat. Emily clipped the pen to the chart. Your discharge is set for tomorrow morning, she said. Warren will do the final clearance. She paused. Call your daughter back before Christmas. She lives 4 hours away, Darlene said. I know, Emily said. Call her anyway. Diane Petro came to Ravenwood on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the preliminary findings were released. Emily had replied to her text eventually, 2 days after she received it, during a quiet moment between rounds, and they had exchanged a few messages, brief and careful, 2 people feeling out whether the ground between them could hold the weight of what they had in common. Petro had been a pediatric nurse. She'd left 8 months after her first formal notation and had spent the months since working part-time at a clinic 40 miles away and trying to figure out what to do with the anger that had nowhere clean to go. They met in the break room. Petro was 34, brown-skinned, with the kind of face that had been through something and came out the other side knowing the difference between what it looked like and what it cost. They sat across from each other with coffee. They were both drinking out of obligation rather than desire, and they talked for 40 minutes, and what they talked about was not strategy or the oversight process, or what was going to happen next with Victoria Hale's disciplinary proceedings. They talked about what it actually felt like, the specific erosion of being managed out of a place you were good at, the way it made you doubt the thing you knew was solid, the cost of carrying something that other people couldn't see. I kept thinking I was being too sensitive, Petro said. That's the worst part. She never said anything that was technically wrong. It was always protocol, always a reasonable administrative concern, and I kept second-guessing my own reading of it. That's what the mechanism relied on, Emily said. If it had been obvious, it wouldn't have worked. It worked, Petro said flatly. It did. Until it didn't. Emily held her coffee. What are you going to do? Petro looked at the table for a moment, then, there's a position opening at Ravenwood, pediatric wing. Delvecchio sent me a letter. She paused. I don't know if I can come back. I don't know if I want to, but I wanted to understand it first, before I decided. That's a reasonable way to approach it, Emily said. Is it worth it? Petro looked at her directly. Being here, after everything.
Emily thought about the 36-hour shift and Vic's pale face and Kira Metz's clasped hands in the corridor and Darlene's daughter sleeping in the family chair. She thought about the medication error at 5:43 in the morning and Harold Metz, who was home now, discharged 6 days ago, with his daughter beside him and a follow-up appointment on the calendar and a card he'd given Marcus, handwritten, asking him to pass it along to the nurse who came in early. Emily had the card in the breast pocket of her scrubs. She'd put it there the morning Marcus gave it to her and hadn't taken it out. "Yes," she said. "Not because it's easy, it's not easy, but the work is real and the patients are real, and when you do it right, you change something for someone." She paused. "That doesn't stop being true because someone tried to use paperwork to make you feel like it wasn't enough." Petro looked at her for a long moment. "Did they get to you?" "Hale, did she make you doubt yourself?" Emily considered lying. She considered the version of the answer that was cleaner and more reassuring and reflected better on her. "Yes," she said, "for about 6 weeks. Every time I wrote a chart, I wondered if I was writing it wrong. Every time I came in early, I second-guessed whether I should." She met Petro's eyes. "And then a dog walked into the lobby and found me, and I stopped wondering." Petro looked at her. "That's not a metaphor, is it?" "No," Emily said. "It's not." The formal recognition came in the 5th week. It was not a ceremony. Emily had specifically, and in writing, declined a ceremony. What it was instead was a meeting in the hospital's main conference room, the large one, not Conference Room B, attended by Delvecchio Thorne from the Oversight Board, Warren, Patrice, the department heads, and a representative from the County K-9 unit who had driven up from the south end of Cedar Falls and who had apparently been wanting to meet her since the morning Rex came through the service entrance. Delvecchio read a formal statement into the record, acknowledgement of the Oversight Board's findings, institutional apology for the conduct of the administrative period under review, confirmation of the expungement of all documentation flags from Emily's personnel file going back 14 months, official recognition of her contribution to the care of 4 military patients during a critical overnight operation. He read her service commendation. Not all of it. Parts remained classified, would likely remain classified, and Emily had decided that was acceptable. But enough. Enough for the people in the room to understand the shape of what she had done and where she had been and why she had known, without explanation, exactly what to do when 3 SUVs pulled into the ambulance bay and a critical patient came through the doors. The room was quiet in the way of people absorbing something they hadn't known they were missing. Warren, who was standing 3 feet to Emily's left and who had been in the building for everything and had covered for her and argued with her and handed her bad dispensary machine coffee at the moments it was most needed, said nothing during the reading. He looked at the table. His jaw was tight in the way of a man who was not going to have a visible reaction in a professional context, which was his right, and which Emily respected. After the reading, Delvecchio looked at her. "Ms. Carter, is there anything you'd like to say?" Emily stood at the end of the conference table in her scrubs. She'd come from a shift. She'd told them she wasn't changing. They'd agreed. And she looked at the room. She thought about what she could say. There were things she'd been waiting to say for 14 months, some for 4 years, that had the satisfying weight of being earned. She could say them. Nobody in the room would have objected. She said something else instead. "The medication error I caught in room 714 6 weeks ago, the one that got cited as a protocol deviation, caught a 40 milligram discrepancy in a 67-year-old man who later developed a pulmonary embolism. Early intervention in the embolism was possible in part because I'd been watching his chart closely. Because I came in early." She kept her voice level. "I didn't do that to be recognized. I did it because Harold Metz deserved someone paying attention. That's true of every patient on this ward every day, regardless of whatever else was happening in this building." She paused. "What I want is for the people in this room to go back to their departments and make sure that every nurse, every orderly, every person who comes in before their shift because the work needs